Well, hello, Adult Sunday School Leader. Hope you're having a great week. I hope you had a wonderful day off. If you had a day off on Monday for Labor Day, I know I enjoyed mine. Hope you did too. Well, we are continuing in the unit that's called James, Living Out Your Faith. This is the second lesson called Faith on Display in Your Relationships. And the scripture is James chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. And the point of this lesson is don't play favorites. That's pretty short and to the sweet point, isn't it? Don't play favorites. Well, if you keep your lesson material from years gone by, this is the same lesson passage as we had on February the 10th, 2002. That's 20 years ago. If you've been teaching that long, salute. And also April 10th, 2005, September 15th, 2013, and September 9th, 2018. Well, so we look at the first four chapters of our text, James chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. I'm going to spend the majority of our time on this section. Okay, got a lot of examples and stories and stuff to share. Well, this chapter begins with a direct statement that leaves no doubt about what it means. And that is believers must not show favoritism. And you think, well, why does James need to emphasize that idea of favoritism? Well, he kind of sets it up back in chapter 1, doesn't he? He talks about the brother in poor circumstances and rich circumstances back in verses 9 and 10 of chapter 1. And we know that also back in chapter 1, verse 27, that true religion is to look out after the helpless, which is usually the poor. Then in the last half of chapter 1, he encourages his readers to put their beliefs into action. Now remember, James is writing to Jewish Christians, and since Christianity has its roots in Judaism, it was probable that some of the Jewish worship customs would find their way into Christian worship, even customs that maybe shouldn't have ever started. And one such practice was to give seats of honor in the synagogue to those who somehow earned them or thought that they earned them. You know, when Jesus was talking about the hypocrisy of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law in Matthew 23, he mentioned that the love or coveting those seats of honor in the synagogue was what those religious leaders desired. And knowing that cultural context kind of helps us make sense out of verses 2 and 3 of our text this week. It makes a little more sense because we tend to judge on appearance. When we pay better attention to the person who appears to be rich rather than the one who appears to be poor, we've made a judgment, haven't we? We've said to ourselves that the person who appears to have some means deserves a better seat, more attention, more perks than the one who seems to be destitute. Well, think about the early church. At first, at least, it was primarily consisted of poor folks. Rich folks who became believers. Now, they weren't to be considered a trophy, is what James is kind of referring to here. Now, in the world, there's this class distinction, and we know it exists, but in the church, all are equal before God. And we should look back at Galatians 3:23 to tell us that, shouldn't we? There's neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female, for you all are one in Christ Jesus. You see, God doesn't show favoritism, and we shouldn't either. We can see that back in Romans 2:11, that God does not play favorites. He does not show favoritism. Right? Now that word favoritism in James 2:1 literally means the lifting of the face. It's similar to our nose in the air. Okay? We're not to have any of that. No snootiness. And this wasn't just a warning. The construction of the sentence here in Greek indicates that this was a practice that it was already happening. And so some translations follow this thought and use stop showing favoritism. Now, how do churches today show favoritism? Of course, the obvious categories that come to mind are race and wealth, which have both been areas of division for centuries, even in the church. And now, what I'm going to say, this is not a statement of condemnation, but it's something for you to think about. Okay, how well does your church reflect its surrounding community? Okay, I'm going to tell you a story of an interview I had back when I was graduating seminary. I was just a little less than a semester away from graduating. This was in 1998. And I had an interview, had done some phone interviews and with a church in southern Mississippi. And I got down to the final 3 candidates. And they sent a questionnaire with a whole bunch of questions on it, and I was to handwrite out my answers. They wanted to see my sloppy handwriting, I guess. And the very last question said, is there anything else about you that you think we should know? And I thought, okay, I've lived in Arkansas long enough. I know how it is in the South. This is Mississippi. I'm going to make a statement here. And so I said, I believe that a church should strive to reflect its surrounding community. Well, I think a week or two went by, and I finally got a call from the pastor. And he said that they had scrapped all three of the top three, and they were starting all over. But he said, your statement that you made, that very last statement, that really caused some good discussion in our group. So I don't know if that ever did any good to that church, but anyway, it's just one story that churches sometimes just get into this habit of reaching the ones like us and not thinking about the ones surrounding us. Okay, and so obviously I didn't go to that church. I went to a church in Southwest Kansas. Well, then I was interviewing after 5 years in Kansas. I was interviewing with this church in Mountain Home, Arkansas, and they had sent me a packet of stuff. And one of the items in the packet was a church directory. So I was having a phone interview, and I had the question. I said, "Well, I noticed that there are no people of color in your church directory." I said, "What's the church's reaction if somebody of color were to walk in?" And the head of the committee answered that, and she said, "Well, they would be more than welcome. We just don't have that many people of color in our area." And sure enough, I did a little research, and that area in that county is 96% white and only 0.6% black. So anyway, a church, in my opinion, should strive to reach its surrounding community. All right, let's get back to James. James's choice of words here takes the comparison to the extreme. If he were a poor working man, a different word would have been used here, right? The poor man that walks into the meeting. In modern terminology, the word that he used here, this is a homeless man. He's a bum. He didn't have any money. He didn't have anything. He's a beggar. He's the lowest on the human scale of class. Then James says that if you do this, if you have this favoritism, that you are judges, that you have set yourself up with evil motives, because when you do that, when you make this favoritism, when you make this judgment, you're setting yourself up as a judge over a person's value just based on their outward appearance. So you are a judge. Now, what does 1 Samuel 16, the last half of verse 7 say? Man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. Now, this might bring up some discussion about appropriate attire for church services. I want to take a couple of minutes and to talk about another instance that I had in church. Well, this might bring up the discussion about what's appropriate attire to wear for church services. I know we sometimes have that conversation in church staffs and all that, don't we? Well, I'm going to take a minute or two to talk about the appropriate address in church. What's acceptable, what's not. So I've got this letter here. When I was at my former church back in North Arkansas, had a guy who wrote a note on an offering envelope and stuck it in the plate. And I gave his name and address and all that. So I wrote him a letter and sent it back to him. And I said, "Dear so-and-so, okay, thank you for writing a question on the back of your offering envelope that has been the topic of a newspaper article and the subject of recent letters to the editor." Remember, that was back when we had newspapers, and small town people are writing letters about things that are really church matters. And anyway, really exciting here. So anyway, he says, I say, "It's always exciting to know what concerns people. You've asked about our congregation's position on the casualness of one's appearance at church. We don't have a formal position on the matter, but I believe that if one looks around the auditorium on any given Sunday, a person will note that most attenders have on nice clothes. There are some, however, that do not. As a staff, our thought is that people should be welcomed into church regardless of their clothing, providing that it's decent. We certainly wouldn't suggest anyone come to the sanctuary dressed in a bikini. However, if someone's wearing jeans and a t-shirt, why shouldn't they be welcomed? There are some in our church who honestly don't own any better clothes than that." So this brings up the subject of subjectivity. Apparel considered church clothes by one may not be nice enough for another. Do men have to have on ties? What about pants on women? Another concern would be price and style. Which is more acceptable, a man wearing a nice pair of khakis and a polo shirt, or a man wearing a 30-year-old $3 jacket and tie recently purchased from the Salvation Army. With so many subjective topics, we feel these issues are best left for God's conviction through an individual's conscience. And then thanks again, come by the office if you want to talk about this anymore. Never heard from the guy again. So anyway, just another example of appropriate. What's appropriate? Do we judge based on how a person looks? I think sometimes we do that, don't we? Now, if that sounds familiar, 4 years ago, September 9th, 2018, I also read that letter in a PrepTalk where it was a very similar topic. Well, let's talk about race for a minute. Now, Jesse Duplantis, really, he's not one of my favorite TV preachers, but I do like what he said about Pride and Prejudice. He said that we were all made out of dirt. That there is white dirt, there's red dirt, yellow dirt, brown dirt, and black dirt. So we all came from the same place. We're dirt. Now we would think that it was crazy if we saw one clump of dirt telling another clump of dirt, I'm better than you are. And that's exactly what we do when we tell someone who's not the same color as we are, I'm better than you are. I'm so different that we can't associate with each other. We're all just dirt. And no matter what color of dirt we are, we're still just dirt. Okay. All right. Now, also, during World War I, rest homes, they were operated, which were designed to serve as a place of fellowship for all soldiers, whether they were officers or enlisted men. And over the entrance of such houses were posted these words, abandon all rank, ye who enter here. Same thing, it's got to be in the church. Social status, race, just wipe that away. All are welcome here. Well, that's just our first 4 verses. Okay, we're going to go a little quicker here through these last verses. Verses 5 through 7, chapter 2. Now, as I previously stated, in the first century, Jewish believers were generally poorer folks. Their Jewish families had turned their backs on them. The Romans hated the Christians, so there wasn't too much social hope for them. Now remember, this is just a generalization, okay? Also, the rich folks would loan people. They would loan money to poor people and then charge them this outrageous high interest rates. And then they'd see them on the street and literally grab them and take them into court and sue them for everything they had. And so this is what James is referring to here. Generally, the rich folks were taking advantage of the poor folks. And yet when a rich person came into a service, they were treated like royalty at the expense of someone with lesser means. But James says that God has chosen the poor. What does he mean by that? Well, James is definitely not saying that the rich can't be saved. Generally speaking, it's true that it's more difficult for rich people to become believers because rich folks tend to be more self-reliant and don't see the need for anyone to help them or save them. Just like Jesus said in Matthew 19:24, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. But it's not impossible. Because as Jesus concluded in verse 26, with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. And I believe this gets back to what we learned last week in James chapter 1, verse 9, where James wrote that believers in humble circumstances take pride in their high position, that their position of being a child of God, regardless of their status on earth. So not only has God chosen the poor to be rich in faith, but God also chose the poor when he identified with him. When Jesus came into the world, he arrived not as a noble king, but as the child of ordinary poor people. Now, verses 8 through 11. In verse 8, we see the phrase, love your neighbor as yourself. We know that, don't we? We know that phrase, but it's also known as the royal law that we see here in James. In Matthew 22, verses 34 through 40, Jesus was asked by an expert in the law, hey, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus replied, the first was to love God with your whole being, and the second was to love your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus was stating that loving God and loving others were on equal footing. And we learned a few weeks ago in our previous unit about who our neighbor is. Who is that? Well, it's anyone whom we come in contact with, especially those in need. So if we keep the royal law, loving your neighbor as yourself, we're doing right. But if we show favoritism, we aren't really loving our neighbor, because who's in need more, the rich guy or the poor guy? When we show favoritism, when we shun the poor to cater to the rich, we're actually breaking that very law that we say we're keeping. So just as there's no distinction among classes of people with God, there's also no classes of distinction between sin. Now, yes, there are different earthly consequences, but God's law isn't a buffet where we can get to pick and choose what we'll obey. We might think that as long as we're getting a passing grade, say, oh, I'm doing 70% of what God requires, then we'll be okay. No, it's either 100% or fail. It's a pass-fail, and 100% is the only pass. But wait a minute, you say, that's Old Testament, right? We're not under the law anymore. We're under grace. That's true. But look at what the next set of verses say. In the last couple of verses, verses 12 and 13 of James chapter 2. James now comes to this concluding thought in this section. So speak and act as those who are to be judged under the law of liberty. So we're to speak, right? We're to say what we believe, and we're to act. We are to do what we say we believe. Our walk is to match our talk. We'll be judged, not condemned to hell, but judged for rewards based on what we say and do. If we look in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 12 through 15, it says, if anyone builds on this foundation using gold, silver, costly stones, or wood, hay, or straw, their work will be shown for what it is, because the day will bring it to light. It will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of each person's work. If what's been built survives, the builder will receive a reward. If it's burned up, the builder will suffer loss, but yet will be saved, even though only as one escaping through the flames. I believe that's what James is referring to here. The outcome of this judgment won't be heaven or hell, but rewards or no rewards, because we will be judged not under the law, but under the law of liberty. I recently read that the law of liberty gives us freedom, and this freedom is not the right to do as we please, but freedom is the power to do as we should. If we consistently don't show mercy to others, if we are consistently showing favoritism, perhaps maybe we've not been recipients of God's mercy. It's important to note that our showing mercy doesn't gain God's favor. It shows that we fully understand the basis of our acceptance before God. So let's do these things. Let's let scriptures be our standard. Let's let love be our law, and let mercy be our message. Now, these last two verses set us up for next week's lesson in the last half of James chapter 2, where we'll be looking at faith on display in your actions. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really do appreciate you. Appreciate your comments that you send me from time to time. So what do we always say? Don't forget to pray for and with your class. Thank you very much.